I'm so thrilled to be here and excited that you'll be joining us for this iteration of Core Conversations. Welcome. As I said in my introductory letter, this conversation will be of a slightly different kind than some of the past Core Conversations. The text we'll be reading together, Maylis de Kerangal's 2018 novel Painting Time, which was published in 2021 with a translation by Jessica Moore, is not actually part of my art humanities curriculum. But instead, it's something of a window into the world of what and how I teach my students to see. It's a beautiful novel, one that I absolutely devoured when it was handed to me by my wife, who I want to give full credit to here, last year. But before we talk about the novel, and before we even read it together, I want to tell you a little bit about why I think this novel, about the training of a young painter, will be such an effective entry point into art humanities and what we do in the classroom. So I came to art humanities, and to art history more broadly, as an artist. As an art historian, I study medieval Rome, and I'm interested particularly in the kind of interrelationships between art and power, how the papacy, for example, used images as propaganda, and how pre-modern power relations really shape our own visual world. And like any good medievalist, I can bring almost anything back to pre-modern Rome, as you'll see. Here at Columbia, where I've been a lecturer in the Department of Art History and Archaeology since last fall, I've taught art humanities, as well as classes on Gothic and medieval revival architecture here in New York City. But before all of that, I trained in studios. I studied sculpture as an undergrad. I worked as a fabricator and as a studio assistant to several different artists. And that technical, kind of really tangible training deeply shapes how I think about the world. And in particular, how I think about and how I teach art history. And now, I should say here that while I studied sculpture, and I still make sculpture, I am truly, and was truly, a terrible painter. This is not going to be 5 weeks of color theory, I promise. But I think the power of Painting Time, this novel, is not in its realistic, technical description of painting, which is admittedly stupendous, or even in its evocation of the physical, optical, mental fatigue of working in a studio, which de Kerangal captures better than any writer I've ever read. But instead, it's attention, to the intensity of the relationship between an artist and her object, and the profound pleasure in making something for someone else to see, for someone else to puzzle over. Art humanities, or art hum, as it's affectionately called, is in many ways a curious course. It's a look at artworks across Western Europe and the Americas from a very broad swath of time, roughly the construction of the Parthenon to the present day. But it's not an art history survey. It's a class about learning how to look. And for many students, it's the first time they'll be looking at artworks in an academic context, the first time they'll be asked to make an argument based on purely visual evidence. And for some, art humanities is the first time they ever set foot in a New York museum, which I make sure they do at least 3 times, twice with me, the Met and MoMA, and at least 1 more time on their own. But at the core of Art Hum is this act of looking. And what I want my students to learn is how to look at art, as Paula, our narrator, comes to learn how to look at realism as artifice, and artifice as realism, to learn to look simultaneously at and through the material of an artwork, to look at an image not as an end unto itself, but as a lens into something deeper, a cultural understanding, a historical period, and always, if only in just a small way, a reflection of ourselves. Artworks, I think, offer a rare and particularly compelling kind of puzzle. One that even after you've solved them or seen the answer, grasped their larger meaning in some sense, there's still a pleasure in returning to, in seeing them again. That is what Art Hum trains students to do. It's twofold: to look and inspect and analyze and develop all of the concomitant critical thinking skills to read an artwork, which really are excellent training no matter what field you're in, but also to cultivate this simple pleasure of looking, to returning to the puzzle. This is truly, I think, a lifelong skill. In Art Hum, we look at paintings and prints and architecture and sculpture, but Painting Time is really a novel about painting. Pigment and binder applied to a surface to create an illusion. And it's worth this focus on a single medium, because far too often, when we talk about art making, we kind of elide that last step, to create an illusion. So that's where I want to start today, at a moment where a painted surface appears to be something that it isn't, and particularly at the pleasure inherent in that deception. And I think we should start in Rome. So, benvenuti a Roma. We're standing in front of the piazza, in front of the Chiesa di Sant'Ignazio di Loyola in Campomarzio, one of the two largest Jesuit churches in Rome. It's built in the 17th century as a chapel for the college that Ignatius of Loyola himself had founded about a century earlier. I told you I can make anything about medieval Rome. The land where the church and college sit had been a gift from the Orsini family, but they famously gave this land to the Jesuits without a lot of money to actually build on it. So a Jesuit architect is hired to build the facade, which we're seeing here, sort of in keeping with the style of the day. But when it came time to adorn the interior, funds were kind of running short. So a painter trained in set design, Andrea Pozzo, was hired to do what the masons couldn't. In the nave, and we're looking here at the ceiling of the nave, he frescoed a ceiling that appears to reach to the heavens, transforming what is actually a really simple plaster barrel vault, this is just a flat sort of rounded ceiling, into the illusion of a celestial court. But his real accomplishment comes in the church's crossing, in the ceiling where the nave and the apse and the transepts meet. And for what it's worth, these are terms that I've warned my students could show up on a quiz the week after next, so you're really being thrown kind of in media res right into Artam here. But here in the crossing, Pozzo gives us something incredible. A dome. Well, not a dome. The illusion of a dome, a space that appears to recede back as though real, darkened by candle soot and lit by a lantern at its peak. But there is no dome. Pozzo's image is an illusion, a fiction, what we call a trompe-l'œil, a trick on the eye, although that term wouldn't even emerge until the Paris Salon about 1800 or so. But this trick does the trick. This painted fictive dome gives the Jesuits their dome, the one they couldn't afford, but it also does something more. The illusion isn't perfect, and like all illusions, it can be broken. When you move from the kind of ideal vantage point in Sant'Ignazio, it becomes clear that the dome is actually just paint. Pozzo's illusion is able to both trick us and remind us that it's tricking us. It draws attention to its artifice, reveling in the show and revealing its secrets. For the Jesuits, the image is perfect. It's a devotional scene that commands awe and a reminder to look askance, to look with discernment, in Jesuitical terms, on the earthly world and its potential fictions. Painterly illusion has a higher purpose here, even a concrete spiritual purpose. When we first meet Paula Karst, our narrator in Painting Time, she's a woman struck with a sudden and inexplicable sense of purpose. She is, as de Kerangal writes, an average young woman, sheltered and predictable, and a little bit on the lazy side, who spends most of her time in a cafe booth in the company of others like her. But the idle Paula has decided, for reasons that are never actually made clear to us in the novel, that her future lies at 30 Rue du Métal in Brussels, at the Institut de Peinture, a fiercely traditional school for decorative painters, a place to learn how to trick the eye. What she finds there is a world that, quite literally, isn't what it seems. We're standing here in the lobby of the Institut van der Kelen Logelin, which is the Decorative Painting Academy in Brussels. It's founded in 1882, and it's located, like Paula's fictitious Institut de Peinture, at 30 Rue du Métal. So this is kind of the real version of the fiction of our story. And as what we see is what Paula sees when she first enters the school. As de Kerangal writes, the walls show a sampling of large marble facing and wood panels, fluted columns, capitals with acanthus leaves, and a window open into the branch of a cherry tree in flower, a blue tit, a delicate sky. Suddenly, she steps over her bag and walks toward the marble slab, the Brescia violet, she will later learn, placing her hands flat against the surface. But instead of the cold touch of stone, it's the texture of paint she feels. She leans in close. It's really a picture. Amazed, she turns to the woodwork and repeats the motion, stepping back and then leaning closer as though she were sort of playing at making the initial illusion disappear and then reappear, moving along the wall, growing more and more stirred up as she passes the stone columns, the sculpted arches, the capitals, the moldings, the stucco. She reaches the window, ready to lean out, certain that another world stands right there, just past the casement. At every point, her fumbling reveals only more painting. So what Paula will learn on the Rue du Métal, and de Kerangal, as you'll see, almost exclusively refers to the school by its address, is a curriculum of illusion. First, it's the imitation of woods, cedar, wild cherry, Makassar ebony, teak, tuja, and walnut. And then the imitation of marbles. Bleu beige, brèche violet, serpentine, black portor, white Carrara. This imitation, this illusion, is a craft of attention. And what we're looking at here are students in the actual institute in Brussels learning to paint marble. Paula learns the technical processes of painting, but also how to read and predict the veining in a stone, how to render the deep black of Portor marble, which her friend Kate memorably pitches to a client as a slick of pure oil, or the timelessness of tortoiseshell. Paula is training to deceive, to take simple forms and adorn them with materials and surfaces too costly or too rare to use. And what we're looking at here is a before and after of a dresser painted in faux bois, which is faux wood, and faux marble by Benjamin Lai, an American who graduated in the 90s from the Institut van der Kelen in Brussels. But as Paula paints, she finds a purpose in this craft, in this steadfast dedication to making a perfect replica, not just something precise, but something real, an illusion almost more real than real. As de Kerangal sets her novel in the mid-2010s, a moment in which social media and the notion of what constitutes real life for a young artist are coming into flux. But in the novel, it's actually deception and illusion that give Paula the kind of discernment to find herself. Paula's training takes her into worlds of painterly illusion. She works as a set decorator at Cinecittà, the famous film studio complex in Rome that was founded by Mussolini, but probably made most famous by Fellini and Sergio Leone, who created entire worlds for their films. They remade the city of Rome or reproduced the wilds of West Texas in the studio backlot. Paula travels to Russia, where by the light of an iPhone, she mixes the colors to recreate the world of Anna Karenina's drawing room. But finally, this world of illusions brings her back to France, to Lascaux 4, a massive project to reconstruct a perfect one-to-one scale model of the famous prehistoric cave of Lascaux in Montignac, preserving forever the delicate environment of the cave and allowing visitors to see the art directly. And today, if you go to the caves in the Dordogne, these replicas are actually all you can visit. You can't ever see the real caves. Now, ironically, this is an image of one of the artists producing Lascaux 4 right around 2015 behind me. Ironically, the only way into this ancient world for Paula is through technology. Paula is painting now from 3D scans, from cloud point maps and LiDAR reconstructions. And as she paints, as de Kerangal writes, little by little, the cave is no longer the object of copying, but it's become the laboratory of the art of replicas, generating more and more precise technologies, a world of points to measure, data to collect, paintings to duplicate, odors to reproduce, lights to simulate, a world in the form of a puzzle, whether assembled panels are made of paper or resin. Prehistorians became artists, artists became scholars, archaeologists imagined scenographies. Each one shifts their axis. Each one travels into the landscape of the other. To replicate the cave is to render it visible in order to create its portrait. So I want to leave us here in this shifting landscape of reality and illusion, of history and myth, a world like the ceiling of Sant'Ignazio in Rome or the lobby of the Rue du Métal, a world in the form of a puzzle. I hope, like any artwork, this novel and our conversation becomes a puzzle that you can return to again and again. Thank you.